Hello, cocodrilos. Welcome back to my channel and to another book. Cocodrilos, the book that I have chosen to read today is so inspiring. And what is inspiring about it is that it was inspired by a teacher. And we all know teachers, huh? Well, cocodrilos, without further ado, let's read this wonderful book. Thank you to the author and illustrator for creating such a wonderful masterpiece. Thank you. Mabel Beecher, Future Teacher, written by Cari, illustrated by Lisa Hunt. You won't believe what happened. The best teacher ever, Mrs. Ampersand, had to leave school before kindergarten was over. She was supposed to stay forever. A baby is born every 11 seconds in the United States, she announced, and mine is coming unexpectedly soon. This is Mrs. Ampersand on the day she left school with Mr. Ampersand. I am as big as a blue whale, she laughed. That's the biggest mammal on earth. She gave each of us a lightning-fast hug, including one for me, Mabel Beecher. Mrs. Ampersand was funny and smart, and the best reader when she had story time. She made hard words like this and seem easy. Just sound them out, she said. And she gave us popsicles every Friday if we tried hard all week. Ampersand. She made us feel brave when the lights went out during a storm. Did you know that Thomas Edison was afraid of the dark before he invented the light bulb? She told us last week. At our last assembly, our principal, Mr. Fairchild, said, Mrs. Ampersand is a teacher and a half. We'll miss her and her teachable moments every day for the rest of the school year. Some of my friends cried. That reminded me of one of Mrs. Ampersand's teachable moments. Just think, people, I told everyone, if we were traveling in outer space, tears wouldn't roll down our cheeks because there is no gravity up there. That night, I told my mom and dad, I am more than slightly worried about how our class will survive kindergarten without Mrs. Ampersand. You'll be fine, Mabel, they said. Just use your noodle. I didn't tell them that I was more than slightly jealous that Mrs. Ampersand's new baby will be seeing her every day while I'll be seeing a substitute. Who, by the way, is here today. Her name is Mrs. Winback. Albert Blunt immediately started making mouth noises and fake sneezing. Mrs. Ampersand told us to be kind to every living thing. Mrs. Winback is a living thing. So I said, Albert, you're disappointing Mrs. Ampersand by being rude. Just like that, Albert stopped. No one wanted to disappoint Mrs. Ampersand, not even Albert Blunt. Mrs. Winback started telling us all about natural gas. She didn't even ask what we'd been learning that day Mrs. Ampersand left. Mammals. Millions of years ago, animals and plants were buried deep under the earth and got so hot they gave off fumes, said Mrs. Windbag for the 47th time. I felt like making mouth noises or flying away like a bat. But I didn't. I was kind to Mrs. Windbag for over an hour. Then I thought of something else Mrs. Ampersand told us. No question is ever not important enough to ask. So I raised my hand. Can we please talk about something else now? I asked. Guess what Mrs. Windbag said? Be my guest, Mabel. So I stood up and told the class everything unboring I knew about bats. There are over 1,000 kinds of bats, I said. The biggest is the size of a pigeon. The smallest is the size of a bee. At recess, I showed everyone how to hang like a bat. Even Mrs. Windbag tried it. We got back to our classroom just in time because a storm was brewing. The lights went out again. Only Mrs. Windbag didn't make us feel brave like Mrs. Ampersand had. Darkness is the absence of light, said Mrs. Windbag with authority. That didn't help Marianne Saltpeter, who was shaking like a leaf, and Big Oliver Crumb, who started counting backwards from 500 to keep himself from biting his nails. So I used my noodle and told the class a poem that my grandma once taught me. That baby bat screamed out in fright. Turn on the dark. I'm afraid of the light. After that, Albert Blunt took out every single book about bats from the school library. That must be how learning works. Mrs. Windbag had a lot to learn about kindergarten. She needed some help in the reading out loud department. So I made a suggestion. Take your time to savor each word, Mrs. Windbag. I said gently and in private, just like Mrs. Ampersand used to tell me. On Friday, when it should have been popsicle time, because we tried hard all week, Mrs. Windbag brought in the most gross, grown-up foods you could ever gag on. Asparagus, artichokes, and anchovies. These are my favorite food, she said. We tasted them because Mrs. Ampersand said we should try new things. Truthfully, even my dog wouldn't have tried the anchovies. You won't believe what Mrs. Windbag said on Monday, though. She brought in lemonade and a big pizza cookie. Mrs. Ampersand always told us, everyone makes mistakes. It's all about fixing them. While we ate our treat, Mrs. Windbag talked about our graduation day next week. I would like you to think about and share your most memorable moments in kindergarten, she explained. I'll be playing my bagpipes to celebrate the big day. Then she shows a picture of her riding in a hot air balloon. It was very memorable. Mrs. Windbag was trying hard not to be boring, I could tell. So I asked my mom if she could help me bring in popsicles for Mrs. Windbag. That's using your noodle, Mom said. On graduation day, everyone was all dressed up. We walked across the stage to Mrs. Windbag's music. Look who was first, Oliver Crumb. I can count backwards from 500, he said. It was exciting when I learned that the bats had babies like people, said Albert Blunt. I want to be an inventor like Thomas Edison when I grow up, said Marion Saltpeter. Then it was my turn. I'll never forget how sad I felt when I realized that Mrs. Ampersand wouldn't be my teacher anymore. So I started practicing to be just like her. I'd like you to meet Mabel Beecher, future teacher me. After the last kindergarten spoke, everyone applauded thunderously. Guess who I saw in the audience? Mrs. Ampersand, and there was her new baby. Then Mrs. Wimback invited us all to a party in honor of us, even Mrs. Ampersand. There was whipped creamy cake, and there were 3 kinds of grown-up gelato, pomegranate, mocha java, and pistachio, which were all delicious, by the way. I tried them. Do you know that the tip of your tongue is for tasting sweets? I asked everyone, winking at Mrs. Ampersand. She winked back at me. And you wouldn't believe this either. Mrs. Ampersand let me hold her baby, Andy. That was my second most memorable moment in kindergarten. I'll teach him everything I know. The end. What a wonderful book about Mabel Beecher and who inspired her to be the teacher that she wants to be. We all know teachers that inspire us to try to be like them. At least be kind, be happy, spread joy, all that fun stuff. Thank you to the author and illustrator once again. Gracias. And don't forget to follow your dreams. If you want to be an astronaut, an engineer, an architect, a vet, a teacher, anything you want to be is possible. Cocodrilos, dream big. Thank you for stopping by to my channel. Thank you, thank you, thank you. If you haven't done so, subscribe, like, share, leave me a comment. Have a wonderful day, cocodrilos. Hasta luego.